Thanks so much for everyone participating on today's webinar. I think all told we had almost 225 BioBreak members sign up, which is a tremendous showing. It may also reflect people still being at home and a little bored around lunchtime. Either way, we'll take it as a win. Bring Your Own Coffee is a webinar series that we launched about 2 months ago. It's a bi-weekly gathering of life science executives to discuss material topics in our industry. Today's topic will be on business development, specifically focusing on platforms and how people actually develop drug discovery and development platforms and then conduct business development activities to support those platforms and companies. We have a tremendous group of panelists who I will introduce shortly. I do want to mention, though, that everything we discussed today will be on the record. We do make recordings of these presentations available to our members, and they're distributed to attendees after the call. I should also mention that one of the nice things about Zoom is you can send via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen questions to myself or other panelists. And what we'll do, depending on when they're sent in, either incorporate them to the flow of the discussion or bring them up at the end. And a number of people have already sent questions in advance, so we'll certainly look forward to discussing those topics. I want to thank our 2 anchor sponsors for this event, with them an advisory and accounting firm, and Locust Walk Partners, a global life science transaction firm. So without that, I will dive right in and start introducing our panelists. And I'll go clockwise on my screen. So Scott Greenberg, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Scott Greenberg. I'm the Chief Business Officer of Aerobiotherapeutics. We're an early stage platform company developing centurins, which are a novel engineered protein. We like to say that anything an antibody can do, a centurin can do better. And we are focused in the early days on developing centurin oligonucleotide conjugates, with the idea being that there's a lot of promise in the RNA space. So I'm sure we'll get into that later, but as for myself, I started my career more on the financial side. I worked with Goldman Sachs Healthcare Banking Group for a couple of years, and then spent more than 12 years at Celgene, where I did a number of things, both doing deals on the BD side, as well as living with deals when I ran R&D project teams. So happy to be here today and to share my experiences.
Fantastic. Jennifer Burkhauser.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Jennifer Burkhauser. So I'm heading up corporate strategy at EGenesis. We are a gene editing company based in Cambridge, applying CRISPR and the latest tools in gene editing to creating biocompatible transgenic organs to solve the global organ crisis. We were founded in 2016 and just raised a Series B last fall. My background has been in the industry about 20 years, 15 of which have been on the large and small pharma side, and then prior to that was on the investing side with Domain Associates.
Wonderful. Tim Herpen from the West Coast.
Hi, everyone. Tim Herpen. So I'm at Johnson & Johnson, and I'm heading the business development group that does infectious disease and vaccines. I've been with J&J in this role for about 6 months, so mainly during the pandemic. Before that, I spent time both in pharma and biotech. So just before that, I was the CBO at Caribou Biosciences, which is a CRISPR gene editing company. And then before that, I spent about 7 years at AstraZeneca and about 11 years before that with BMS, both in various BD roles.
Wonderful. And Andy Meyerson.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Andy Meyerson. I am a Senior Vice President at Locust Walk, where I run our U.S. transactions group. Locust Walk is a global life science transaction firm headquartered here in Boston, also offices in New York, San Francisco, Tokyo, and London, working with a lot of emerging biopharma companies, both partnering, licensing, M&A, both on the buy side and sell side, as well as helping them raise capital, thinking through their corporate and business development strategy. I've been with Locust Walk now for close to 7 years, and before that was a corporate attorney working with emerging growth companies here in Boston, with a focus still in the life sciences.
Great, Andy. Wonderful introduction. We're going to start with you. So the first thing we're going to discuss today are trends our panelists are seeing within the business development space and platforms. So maybe just given that you have the pulse on transactions, what you're seeing in the platform space right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we all know that the last couple of years in biotech in particular have seen a dynamic which is a little bit unusual for us given the availability of capital. And so what that's actually done is had a pretty profound impact on BD overall, because companies, as always, are trying to weigh raising capital and progressing platforms or programs themselves versus looking for either non-dilutive financing or some other rationale for partnering. And so what we're seeing is a stronger preference towards financings actually over some of the BD deals. And what that's done for platform companies in particular is it's enabled the deals that they are pursuing to be more in pursuit of future financings in a lot of ways. And so thinking about things like platform validation or access to additional capabilities, and leveraging big pharma partners more as a way to leverage their next round of financing and give themselves the validation that they need. And so what we've been seeing is both an increase, obviously, in the IPOs and crossovers and in larger rounds. EGenesis is a perfect example of that in the last few years in terms of the Series B. But even beyond that, we're also seeing a less of an interest in M&A and much more of a focus on partnering. And the rationale being is because capital is accessible, M&A doesn't have to be a preferred route, and it's really had an impact on what we're seeing overall. Within platforms specifically, two primary flavors of the deals. One is more of an asset-based partnership, platform partnership, where there's a lead asset with other assets or targets behind it that are being co-developed or solely developed, or on the super earlier side, some more of a overall platform target-based deal where it's more of a menu of choices for the pharma partner as the company continues to move forward. Both are happening frequently, and which is preferable is really more driven by the stage of development of the company.
That's very helpful. And I saw Tim nodding his head a bunch of times, which means he either agrees with you or he's listening to Spotify, but I'll assume he was listening to you. So Tim, you joined J&J in the infectious disease and vaccine group 6 months ago. Pretty interesting timing. Maybe you can share your thoughts on what you're seeing in the infectious disease and vaccine space.
Sure. So clearly, the pandemic has changed quite a bit. It used to be that, the only deal people remembered in the infectious disease space was the Gilead Pharma deal. And
right.
Every morning, you get to the news flow and there's new COVID-related deals. Clearly, it's dominated the last 6 months. I think if you step back, initially there was a big push for people who wanted to get access to assets. So on the vaccine side, within the first few weeks, there were a few deals of people who were already established in the vaccine side, usually had partnered and just expanded their partnership to include a COVID vaccine. So, the example of Pfizer and BioNTech or Sanofi and Translate illustrate that. There's people that actually jumped into the vaccine field. So if you think about the AstraZeneca example, they were not really a vaccine company and they overnight became one by acquiring the Oxford vaccine. So, a lot of very rapid movement there. There were also a few deals on the non-vaccine, on the therapeutic side, GSK and ViiV getting together, Merck and Ridgeback getting together. They were also done in a very quick amount of time. Interestingly, and maybe not apparent to everyone, there were also non-COVID related deals that have been continuing to happen in the IDV space. So, Valneva and Pfizer struck up a partnership for a vaccine, as well as Roche and Dicerna in the sRNA field. So, quite a bit of activity in a field that historically has been relatively quiet.
Yeah, it brings up an interesting point. So you're, running BD for the group. Do you strike while the iron's hot? You have all of this investor interest in vaccines and infectious disease, and maybe deals that would have been hard to get done a year ago. The bar may be lower now. Is that what you or you think other companies are viewing it beyond COVID? Or it's still kind of got to fight for every inch within the organization?
No, I think it's been a lot easier to get the organization's attention, during COVID. And, we've spent actually, in addition to the vaccine we're developing, we spent a lot of time looking at external assets, particularly on the therapeutic side, to see whether there was anything that, we really wanted to jump in and run after quickly. And, we've been able as a BD group to, evaluate things and get resources from the organization that we typically don't get in normal time. So, for us, the pandemic has really helped us accelerate projects.
Fantastic. Jennifer, I'm located in Philadelphia, so are you. Whenever I think of regenerative medicine, I think of Tenjian. And I think things have changed a lot since then. So maybe you can update people on what's going on in the regenerative medicine space.
Yeah, it's interesting, Marty. I think the definition of the space, that the tent sort of broadened over the years. So I think now the sort of working definition is it's cell and gene therapy and tissue engineered products. And so if we look broadly at that definition, we're encouraged by certainly all the progress on the cell and gene therapy side over the last several years, and the money and deal flow going into the space. So if you look at just the first half of 2020, 10.7 billion, I think globally has gone into cell and gene therapy and tissue engineered products just in the first half of this year, which is more than was raised in all of 2019. So investors remain bullish on the space, and we've seen, I think 6 major product deals, or deals rather, in this space in the first half of this year, all of which I think were over 100 million in upfronts or total deal value. So we're certainly really encouraged by the amount of money flowing in the space, the increasing deal volume, and sort of the advancement of products, approvals, and sort of clin reg pathways, in these new spaces. We're certainly charting one ourselves.
Yep, absolutely. And Scott, Arrow's developing a really interesting platform to solve one of the long-standing challenges in biology, which is in drug development. How do you get big things into a cell? And so maybe you can update people on what's going on with product development and different platforms that are being developed in your space and the opportunities there.
Sure. No, as I mentioned at the outset, we're really focused in the RNA space, and I think historically it's been a long time coming in that you've had companies working in RNA medicines for nearly 30 years. And it's really been in the last couple where we've seen great progress with companies like Ionis, Alnylam, and others finally cracking the code, if you will. However, most of those products are really limited to liver-directed targets. And so there's been success in terms of delivery to RNA into hepatocytes, but it's really been very challenging to get these therapies to different tissues. And that's where our technology has great promise in that we can develop RNA conjugates, and with a centurion targeted to specific cells, we can potentially deliver these RNA to a number of different cell types, a number of different tissue types. And there's really been, I think, a lot of momentum in the space, still all very, very early. I mean, we're talking about really preclinical companies. But what we found is that both, I think, investor interest, and you see companies like Avidity Biosciences that just recently went public, and a little bit of an artifact of today's market, is trading at over $1 billion in market cap with not a single patient's worth of clinical data. Another company, Dyne Therapeutics, which is slated to go public this week. And you see, I think, the investor appreciation for what the potential of these platforms hold. At the same time, you have lots of larger companies that are also very interested in expanding their pipeline. And so one of the companies that I mentioned earlier, Ionis, we were fortunate enough to strike an early stage technology collaboration with them. And it's really been, I think, a win-win deal, still early days, but to this point, I think very promising. And so we're again fortunate to be in a hot space, in a hot area, and looking forward to continuing to be on the forefront of growing that platform and really developing new therapies for patients.
Well, Scott, I'm glad you brought this up. And in full candor, I'm on the board of Cure Duchenne, a venture philanthropy, and Dyne and Avidity are both funded companies from Cure Duchenne. So I'm just saying, if Arrow takes a little bit of money from Cure Duchenne, look at what happens. You just have to work on Duchenne then.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's certainly one of the other things is, we have to think about is there's been a lot of interest in the muscle area in Duchenne, and I think that's clearly an opportunity where there's a great need for patients, but also where is our technology best deployed? And in some of these rare disease spaces, where can we carve out space for ourselves, for our own lead products?
And so Arrow's on this great trajectory, but even though it's on a great trajectory, there's a finite amount of people and they have a finite amount of time. You have this big relationship with Ionis. How do you manage the Ionis relationship versus what you guys want to do internally versus the ability to bring on another BD partnership?
Yeah, that is a great question, and therein lies the challenge for us in some extent. We're 21 people as of today, and so we need to be very mindful of resource allocation. And I think in the long run, there's going to be no greater value driver for an early stage company than I think your own lead programs. Certainly I think we've benefited a tremendous amount in working with Ionis in that we do get external validation of our platform. We do get that non-dilutive capital, and frankly, we get to work with one of the leaders in the RNA space and learn and grow through our relationship with them. But by the same token, we can't be a CRO for other companies. And so for this initial collaboration, given who we're working with, given I think all the benefits that we stand to gain, our philosophy has been this cannot fail. In the sense that this is our first deal, this is an important one, and I think you do want to establish momentum for yourself. By the same token, I think we want to make sure that we're carving out sufficient resources to begin working on our own lead programs, because again, that's where the longer term value is going to come to play. So while there's lots, I think, of interest in our platform and lots of different ways that we can go, we're going to have to be very thoughtful and mindful about that next deal and what it looks like. And I think to some extent, Andy, you raised it at the outset. It also goes hand in hand with our financing strategy. And where does the capital come from? How do we scale up? And then how do we best allocate whatever resources we have to put to bear?
That's helpful. And maybe, Tim, I'd love to hear your thoughts, because you've worn many different hats as other panelists here, from very small startups to the largest of large pharmaceutical companies. So you've been on both sides trying to sell your platform to people and then potentially buying platforms. So maybe you can share a little bit of your experience being on both sides.
Yeah, happy to. So I've had the chance when I was at AZ to work on a fairly large platform deal with, interestingly, Ionis, where we were on the receiving end, getting both access to, a clinical stage assets and then a few slots to use their antisense technology. And then when I was at Caribou, I was a bit on the other side, where we had a gene editing platform and we were looking to potentially strike deals with larger companies. In my mind, there's a couple of things. There's always a tension, both on the pharma and on the biotech side, around the scope of the relationship, where particularly if, on the pharma side, you're going to be doing a deal with a technology that's still fairly early and fairly unproven, you're always worried that, as you get validation, if it works out, you'll never have secured enough access to the platform. And on the biotech side, you have exactly the reverse concern that, you'll have given up so much of the access to your platform that, if it proves to be validated, then you'll have given away tons of value and you wouldn't have retained enough for yourself. And I think it's true not only in terms of scope of the deal, it's also true in terms of resources. I think often you're a small company, you have limited resources. If you strike up a big partnership, it becomes more difficult to dedicate the resources to your own programs or to things that are outside of the partnership, and that can be a challenge.
Absolutely. Jennifer, EGenesis is ripe for partnerships. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your internal challenge, platform can be taken a bunch of different directions. How do you pick a lead indication? And then you have partnerships with Bayer and Fresenius. So how that all kind of interplays into lead program selection and prioritization of programs.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the last part first. So interestingly, the Bayer and Fresenius relationships, these were actually not BD deals. These were straight equity investments into our Series B round. So no strings attached, no rights, et cetera. And it's interesting, Andy touched on this earlier. I think there as a young company, there are multiple ways to get that critical early pharma validation. And in our case, this came through equity investments by two big players, not via BD. And if you think about sort of the evolution of the platform, I think it was helpful for us at that point in time, still building the platform, to Tim's point, to not be thinking about giving some of that away as we're still building the platform. So I think the validation came, but in a slightly different way. I think that for, the selection of the lead indication, this is a critical question, existential question for any young company, and there are many ways to do it. It's often very fraught, right? Because it sets you down a very specific path. I guess what I've seen work well, and what we did at EGenesis was we did a few things. One is ensure there's a process, and make sure to take the arbitrariness out of that decision as much as possible. So minimize the chance that there are going to be some decisions made, and then sort of there's a backdoor decision about what the lead indication is, but a real process that has transparency, that also has rigor, and as much rigor as you can inject into it. And then that's also includes as much cross-functional input as possible. So sometimes this is challenging for really young companies that only have a few employees. Maybe it's heavily weighted on the science side, but you really need that commercial input as well. So you need to sort of broaden the circle of influence, bring in advisors, bring in board members for those discussions and that process, so that you incorporate that input, because there's no one truth, right? I mean, there are the scientific and technical and regulatory, but also the commercial and strategic considerations that you really need to make, because if you leave any one of those out, you could end up not making a good decision. So I think ensuring that circle of influence and input is broad is critical too.
I would agree. Andy, being on the transactional and advisory side, I would envision you have a variety of clients who quite literally are developing platforms and show up and say, make money for us. Find a partner, you guys figure it out. So what do you advise these companies? How do you work with them? How do you help them run a BD process to capitalize on their platform?
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally hit the nail on the head, that it's about your lead indication. When you're working off a platform, you have to look at everything in totality. Nothing exists in a vacuum. And so you want to do a BD deal, but then what's your financing strategy? What are your capital requirements? How are you going to make a determination of what's available for partnership versus what you're going to keep for yourself? Which is something that Tim was hinting at in terms of some of the push-pull of trying to put the guardrails on a partnership. And it's actually something that we spend a lot of time with. And so one of the great things about Locus Walk is that it's not just about the transaction doing the deal, but it's what is the strategy behind the transaction? What is it that you're actually trying to do? Why are you doing it? What are you going to ask for? And so something that we've been doing increasingly more and more for these younger platform companies, and even some platform companies that you think should have the answer already, is spending a lot of time to do that upfront strategy work, thinking through, okay, what indications can you pursue scientifically? Okay, now let's start thinking through the other areas you have to speak to Jen's point, around development costs and timelines and commercialization footprints that are going to be required. And is this something that you can do, or are you going to need an external partner for it? And then even starting to think through, okay, here's the list of things I can pursue, but now how do we want to time gap these going forward? Which one do we want to have first? Is it going to be ours? Is that a partnered one? When do we want to try to build out news flow if we're trying to be a public company? And really thinking holistically about the totality of really a corporate development strategy, with BD strategy being only one small, well, not small, but one piece of that overall. But without that, you're going to end up making some mistakes that may not necessarily be that could have been avoided if you had done the right frameworks and the right way of thinking through the issues. And one thing that we're even seeing more and more, particularly for some of the more advanced platforms, is you have some platforms, even like Aero, where the number of places that it can go is astronomical, where it's across therapeutic areas, whether it's an idea or oncology or autoimmune or pretty much anywhere. And you're almost drowning in choice. And so how do you want to focus the company? What is it really that you want to do? But just because you have to focus in one area, does that mean you have to give up the value elsewhere? And so one other thing that we're starting to see more and more of, and you're starting to see some of the announcements and some other announcements are going to be coming in the coming months, is platform companies are really being creative about spin-outs and thinking through, okay, if I can put this aspect of my technology into a side company that can then independently operate, is that a source for value creation not only for the original company, but the original investors, and allows you to execute against programs that you would not be able to do otherwise, because you have limited capacity with capital and capabilities and everything else. And so I think that for a platform company, from the transaction side, what it's really becoming more and more of a function of is making sure you have the right lead asset, figuring out what's going to be behind it, what's yours versus somebody else's. How do you want to position that for people? And then for the things that you're not going to be able to do that you don't want to partner, how's another way to obtain value?
Well, that's a good, so I'd love to throw this open to all four of you, because this spin out of a platform idea comes and goes. And but interestingly, and the two examples over the last, I think, week, maybe 2 weeks, Illumina spinning out Grail, the CTC platform, and then announcement today that Illumina may buy Grail back. And then you see Ionis spinning out Axia and now pulling it back. So, what is your thoughts on spin outs? How do you maximize value, and why do these companies seem to spin it out and buy it right back?
I guess I'll start, and I'd love to hear others' opinions too. But for me, I think it really starts with the rationale for the spin out and how are you setting it up. Is it going to be driven by therapeutic areas? Is it being driven by a particular type of product that can come out of your platform? It's really driven by sort of the platform itself as to what you may or may not be able to do. If something's going to be non-strategic for the primary company, but still valuable for somebody else, if you're setting up the spin-out company almost as its own independent entity that just has the cross licenses back and forth to enable them to access your technology, that's much more likely to be able to survive on its own. It's going to have its own set of investors. It's going to have its own management team. It's going to have its own things that it's pursuing. And it's almost like you're taking things that you're not going to get value off of yourself, whether from investors or from a big pharma partner that's not going to develop in those areas either as of today, and giving you a chance. And so, I mean, in terms of the deals that you just mentioned, I think that those are examples where they didn't go all the way on the spin out. They kept their tentacles in a little too tight, which enabled them to bring it back in. If you're really going the spin out route, what that means is although you retain some ownership and there's some commonality, it's going to be just as hard for you to acquire that company as it would be for J&J.
Yeah. I think to Andy's point, one of the challenges we have had at Aero is, as I said in my introduction, Centurions can really do a number of different things that antibodies can do. And so from creating bispecific immuno-oncology plays to looking at toxin drug conjugates, we have the capability of doing all of these things. And it's very hard to not look at the daily fierce biotech and see the latest big deal and say, we could do that. And I think it really does take quite a lot of discipline. And I think also just the recognition that as a 21-person company, it is going to be hard enough to make progress in one area relative to then diluting yourself and working across multiple areas. And so that is, I think, a hard decision that we came to as we were building out the platform and really making that strategic decision of what is the right place for our platform to focus in. What I would say is that because we're an early stage company, the level of validation that we have in these different areas is still not so significant because we haven't built out those data sets. And so I think while it is tempting to say, geez, we're not going to get any value from this, let's spin it out to somebody else, do a big BD deal. And I think that, we of course would consider those things. I think there's also just the opportunity cost, and perhaps what you're seeing with some of these others saying, maybe we should bring that back in is not, having somebody else kind of move the ball forward and recognize the full value. And so I think, sure, if I could snap my fingers and be bringing in value from one of these non-core platform areas today, I think that's something that we'd love to do, but that also takes work, it takes effort, and I think again we just kind of come back to there's so much power in focus, and that's so important to our longer term goals right now that we're going to kind of side on simplicity for the time being.
I think I'd echo the opportunity cost point. I think particularly for us, there's some platforms that have breadth and depth, or breadth and less depth. I think if we look at an example like EGenesis, looking at transgenic organs, we have tremendous depth, but there's a finite number of organs that you could potentially replace, right? And so I think a real question to us would be, to Scott's point, do you want to take some of that off the table in the form of a spin out or what have you, or do you really try to maximize as much value creation as possible within the platform? So I think there's a real opportunity cost there that you have to weigh when you're thinking about that route.
Yeah, and I think what they're saying is super important. Not every company is the same. It's not the right answer for everybody, and that's vitally important to really sit down and think through. Is whatever strategy I'm pursuing the right thing for me? Just because someone else was able to do it doesn't mean that it's what I want to do. There's always going to be nuance to every company, every platform. And you have to go into any decision you make with eyes wide open, and making that determination as to why are you doing it. It's less likely that you want to do it if you're a private company versus a public company, because you can more easily point to what you're being valued off of. And it's all about making sure you have full information before going down that kind of path, because it is a serious decision.
Great. So, Tim, were you going to say something?
Actually, something not directly related to your question, but something that I don't think we've touched on when we talk about platform deals. I think from a pharma perspective, it's important for people to understand that there's challenges around valuing platforms. That sometimes can make the deal making a bit more complicated. And so to the extent that you have a deal that combines sort of an asset that's not too far from the clinic and the platform from a larger partner perspective, it does make valuation a bit easier. So you can value the lead asset, that gives you sort of an anchor value, and then on top of that you can add value for the platform, and there's less scrutiny that's put on how much you value the platform. And so in my mind, that's a deal structure that gives you a little bit of advantage there.
That makes sense. Is there any risk? One of the questions that was submitted to us is timing of a BD deal. So can you do a BD deal too early in your company's life that either your technology is not ready or the economics of the deal are inferior to what you would get later, or really that's just something you can't predict because no one can predict the future? So what are your thoughts on timing of a BD deal?
So I think that one of the most common things that we hear, at least when we have a company that we're working with that's done a previous deal, is the phrase, that was a great deal for us at the time, but I would never do that again. And it's true. I think that at the stage of development that you are, the earlier that you are, there's a different type of deal that you'll say yes to versus later on. I mean, Tim just raised the point about it's a lot easier to do it when there's sort of a lead asset that you can anchor against, and then you have a couple other targets and you can put a value per target type structure together to figure out the right way to do it. Scott raised the point that you don't want to just become a CRO, where you're doing work for a bigger company and you don't get to really carry anything forward, and you kind of hand it over at a certain stage in preclinical development. But when you're an earlier company, especially if you have a platform that doesn't have validation, that validation is immensely necessary to even raise the capital, potentially. If you're raising the capital without it, then that deal becomes less important. And so I think that for most young companies, you have one, less leverage in negotiating what the partnership's going to look like, and two, the rationale for doing the deal is different for the rationale from a more advanced company. More advanced meaning even just later in preclinical, you actually know which targets you're going after, you actually have products, as opposed to everything still being in discovery. So it's not that any deal is a bad deal, you have to make sure that the rationale for why you're doing it makes sense.
to piggyback on that, Andy, some of the things we discuss is things you could have done differently in your career doing transactions and lessons learned. And one of the things that you opined about was the need to tell clients at some point you just need to cut and run. And either the terms of the deal or frankly the comfort level around the partner is not there. So maybe you can just give an example or two of when that's happened, how it emerged, and ultimately how you convince the client that now's not the time.
So, I mean, this is obviously on the record, so it'll be a little limited what we can talk about for all of us. But I think that it gets into a point that all of us have made already, which is if you're going to do a BD deal, you really need to understand what the deal is, why you're doing it, and what are the consequences to you down the line. And particularly in the context of a platform deal, if you're giving up too much control or somehow you're removing your own FTO, your freedom to operate, that's something which you have to be very aware of and you have to be careful about because you still need to exist as an independent company. And I think one of the biggest things that some BD folks are loath to do is to actually walk away. And we certainly are loath to do it because we get paid success fees on completed deals. And so you can imagine when we tell a company, you know what, that's not a good deal for you, I wouldn't do that, say no, and whatever, I'm not going to get my fee, I get it, it's the right thing for you. It's a hard conversation. And what it comes down to is getting a feel for the counterparty. Are they going to take good care of the asset? Are they going to be a good group to work with? Are they going to be able to execute in a way that you really hope that somebody can execute? Are they giving enough value at this point in time versus you doing it yourself and moving the ball down the field on your own? But then ultimately looking at things like just how hard is it to negotiate the transaction if someone isn't really acting in a way that you would expect from a partner as opposed to an acquirer, but a partner is somebody you have to work with, then you have to think long and hard if they're the type of group that you want to work with long term. And the other thing, as I'll say, is usually if you decide to cut and run, it ends up being for the best. It means you believe in your product and something else will come along.
And one of the things that Scott and Tim both brought up, and the question will be for both of you in different ways, is I think this is both coming from your time at large pharma when you're looking at deals and there's inertia for the deal. And so people are drinking the Kool-Aid. People will say things like, oh, we de-risk the one or two primary risks of the deal and it's good. Like this is a golden deal. We got to do it. Maybe you can just share a little bit of your experience when that happens and when that situation happens again, what you would potentially do differently.
Yeah, so maybe I can start there. I've had sadly, a couple of experiences where there was a lot of enthusiasm for a deal, and then we did it, and then things didn't turn out exactly the way we wanted it. And in those cases, you inevitably go back to how much due diligence did you do, and what did you miss, and all of that. As you mentioned, Marty, I think one of the nature of the beast is these deals get inertia, particularly if they're competitive and you're trying to do them under short timelines, which can lead you to overlook or not spend enough time, taking into account potential findings that sometimes are there, and you just have to look at them and think hard about them. And so I think for me, one of the lessons is, always be careful with your due diligence and make sure you never cut corners there.
Yeah, I think if you think about it, there are so many incentives in the system to do deals, right? BD people generally don't get rewarded for not doing deals. Research analysts on Wall Street generally don't come out with reports that XYZ companies shouldn't be doing BD unless there's a series of bad BDs left in their wake. And so I think there's this built up bias towards action and getting things done. And then it's, doubly hard, I guess, when you're in the midst of that process and there's time pressure and there's executive pressures of getting things done. And so it is a lot, I guess the first thing I say is it's a lot easier said than done. I guess, one lesson that I learned where something went south is that, on paper, everything looked good. It made sense. case, the financials ended up working out, but just had this instinctual feel that the relationship and the people were not a good fit, that there was sometimes slightly talking sideways at each other. And it's, oh yeah, we'll figure that out, later. And sure enough, I think, the inability to align and really collaborate effectively once the deal was completed was a large reason why I think, things did not end up as well as they could have. So, I think you really do have to look across multiple aspects when you're evaluating these things strategically, of course, due diligence, scientific diligence, but I think the people component is a particularly important one too.
That's helpful. Jennifer, I'm going to ask you a question that came in through the Q&A portal. So someone asked, at some point you're speaking to a partner, it's clear you like them a little bit, they like you, you're sort of dating. And at some point you got to tell them, well, this is the deal we're looking for. This is the structure. This is the amount of money. How do you think about that when you're engaging pharma partners? When's the right time to discuss the financial terms, and what's your approach to doing so?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the situation. It's hard to say exactly what I think that you want to have a sense that the two parties are serious enough to begin to talk about those specifics, but at the same time, you also want to do it early enough that you don't go too far down the road, that you're way off base from each other, and you're wasting both parties' time. So I think early, not too early, but early enough that you haven't wasted organizational time when you might be very far apart.
You typically, and maybe this is a question for everyone, from the time that you throw out financial structures, what's your general goal to getting to a term sheet? And then what's your own internal clock from going from term sheet to deal? And is there sort of a drop dead date for each in your mind where if they don't happen, it's just probably not a good use of your time?
So I guess I'll start on that one. I think sort of what Jen was saying, it's driven by who the counterparty is and what expectations you can reasonably have on them. Doing a deal with J&J is different from doing a deal with a much smaller biotech. And you have to be cognizant of that and be respectful of it and know that to the point that Scott raised from his days at Celgene, there's more internal work that needs to be done in order to get to the point that the deal can move forward. So I think for us, there's always two schools of thought. One is, do you put the stake in the ground and you make the other side put a stake in the ground on value? If you do it first, you're essentially negotiating against yourself unless you come in high enough. If you come in too high, it scares the other party off and the deal never gets done and you would have accepted something lower. So it's always like a perfect rock in the hard place type situation. What we tend to do is make sure that any argument that you have is based off of facts and reality. Whether it's based off of comps or something else about your product that enables you to have a justification beyond because I said so and because it's what I want. At least in the earlier stages of your company, it's hard to get away with that. Later on, you might be able to. But really enabling yourself to have a conversation once the other party agrees on value. Value meaning not monetary value, but scientific value of what it is that you have, or at least trending in that direction. To start bringing up the rest of the conversation. If you share structural terms, depending on if it's competitive or not, you kind of want to have better visibility within a month on the term sheet to have the back and forth. If you have a term sheet on the table, you hopefully can get that negotiated within about a month or so, which means you leave a month or two for the DA. Obviously, the more complex the deal, the longer those timelines take. But at the same time, you kind of hope that once someone makes the decision to do something, you can get it done in kind of that 3 to 4 month range. It just sometimes takes a lot longer to get somebody to want to do something.
One of the way that I've seen people, try to have sort of an early discussion around structure and terms is to point your partners towards public deals that you like and say, so you don't have to come out with terms, but you say, we've looked at those deals and we sort of like these deal structures. And I think it's a way to give sort of a fairly objective and informal indication of what you have in mind in terms of deal structure or deal value.
I like that strategy. So I'm in breast cancer, Tim. So I'm just going to point to Immunomedics every time. You say that's the deal. Take it or leave it. So one of the things that Tim and Jennifer, in our pre-panel call, there was an interesting kind of dichotomy in responses where we were talking about what it's like to do BD during COVID, where most people are working from home either all the time or at least part of the time. And you two had very different views where Tim found it in many ways more challenging and Jennifer found it less challenging. So maybe each of you can opine about what it's like been to do BD during COVID.
I think for us, there's pieces that are more challenging. There are pieces that are easier. I think the easier piece is, to the extent we already have a relationship with a potential partner, interacting with them through Zoom is actually a bit easier because people on our end are easier to get to. And then usually for the partner, they're traveling less, they're more available. The piece that we've found more challenging on our side is aligning internal stakeholders. A lot of what we do when we do BD in a large organization is, trying to get a large organization to make a decision on an external opportunity. And for that, as it turns out, the informal interactions, the ability to catch people in an informal setting goes a long way in terms of, giving us guidance of where the organization is. And I think what COVID has done is, it's really removed all these informal interactions and replaced them with interactions that are all formal. And that makes the decision-making process a bit more challenging on our side. And you overlay that with a time of general uncertainty, which typically makes large organizations think twice about how much risk they want to take on now, how much investment they want to make. I think makes the whole internal process a bit more challenging for us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would certainly say it's not that we haven't seen, the challenges of COVID that Tim's mentioning. We certainly have. I think the availability of folks has certainly, been a plus, as we're all experiencing, but there definitely have been some challenges. I think, interestingly, we noticed, in August, we, for European counterparts we were talking to, a lot of them were actually able to take vacations, whereas we in the US were not. And so there may have been a slowdown there in discussions, just because of the differences in vacation schedules across the pond. So I would say, we certainly have seen an impact, of challenges rather, in light of COVID, but the availability of folks has been, the ability to reach people via Zoom has certainly, buoyed that a little bit, or, mitigated it somewhat.
One thing that's interesting that I think really drives home what Tim was mentioning about the informal interactions versus the formal interactions is if you look at the licensing deal in the second quarter and now, most of the way through the third quarter, the deals that are getting done are more clinical stage assets than preclinical stage assets. And so to Tim's point about looking into risk assessments, how much risk do you want to take on now, from the pharma companies, there's still big deals that are happening. And yes, there's some preclinical sort of later down in the headlines of the deal, but those lead assets are clinical stage. And so I think that's driven in part because of exactly what Tim was just saying. The organization's a little more risk averse. They want to see some more data that they can, sink their teeth into and decide whether or not the drug is working the way that they intended it to. And it's just in general trending towards people wanting to make sure that whatever deal that they're going to sign their name next to, there's less of a Monday morning quarterback of having to go back and say, okay, what did we miss?
So do you think that's, Andy, do you think that's influenced by Fed policy? So another way of interpreting what you're saying is even the largest of pharma companies are marshaling their resources. They're keeping cash tight, but debt is so cheap right now that if you have a big acquisition, you can use debt for that. And it's a very different category of capital within the pharmaceutical company, and the market responds differently to it. Are you seeing some of that?
So I think that's probably part of it, but I think just overall big ticket M&A, absent the Immunomedics deal that was announced, has generally fallen away. There hasn't been as much of it this year. There's been a much stronger preference from pharma towards licensing transactions, which are structured to, better account for risks in development as opposed to paying all up front for things. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's due to an availability of capital. I think that's really, at least in my opinion, more and maybe Tim knows this better than I do, The pharma companies wanted to focusing in more on the internal pipeline that they're developing and being a little less open to trying to expand out the aperture, at least on the earlier parts of the pipeline, as opposed to looking towards things that are going to be generating revenue sooner if they work. I think that the availability of cheap capital, do you think would make more M&A feasible? And we're just not seeing it. And so there has to be other things that are in play here. And I think it's really more companies just kind of wanting to make sure that their foundation is strong, that they believe in what they're working on internally. And if they need to get something from elsewhere, like we've seen Gilead doing repeatedly over the last couple of months, they're doing it in a way which is fairly creative that doesn't require them to splash out the full acquisition capital other than Immunomedics.
And we had a really intriguing question that just came in that I'll put to all of you, which is you're developing a platform, you sign a great deal with a pharma company. What happens if that pharma company generates bad data and that becomes public? What sort of protections can you put into the agreement to protect yourself against that so the value of your platform is not lowered in such a situation? Scott, it looks like you want to answer.
Question.
Sure. I don't have a great answer. I'm not saying I want to answer, but I think there's some standard things in agreements, right? About what gets released publicly has to be reviewed and agreed by the parties. So I think at a minimum, you're going to be aware. You can hopefully craft anticipatory messaging around what happened and why you don't think that should be leading, casting an overly negative shadow across kind of the full platform. I think there's the other aspects are just around structure and governance and how things work together. I think that there could be instances where you want to make sure that you're involved in the decision making, and the result of the negative data isn't because your partner went out and did something that you didn't do this assay correctly and no wonder why you ended up with this kind of negative result. Beyond that, I think that it certainly can be a challenge, and I think that you really need to be thoughtful about in advance, what are potential outcomes here, and have that kind of scenario planning and thinking and understanding about what does this data really mean? Is it that, geez, our platform really is problematic, or this is a unique one-off and we're going to keep going and we've got a strong rationale for why?
Yeah, I think it's the R&D plan, really making sure that you understand where the platform is going to be used and how, and having some voice at the table in the JSC. You're never going to control the decision making when you're the smaller party. That's always going to be the larger party, and it's hard to even have almost a tie vote. They're always going to control what's going on, but at least you go into the deal having an idea of how they're intending to use it, that they have to execute against, and so you can try to find problems up front. The bad data as it comes out, and Scott's right, you can try to put something in there that speaks to when can you actually release something publicly or not. At some level, things can take a life of their own. And it's an important enough program, they're going to have to talk about it. And so I think it's really more upfront as you head into the deal, having a better visibility into how does the partner intend to leverage your technology.
So going back to Scott, one of the companies that really kind of pioneered a very aggressive licensing strategy was Celgene, where you worked for a number of years. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that strategy played out. And one of the things that I heard coming from the venture side, we had portfolio companies where over a couple of years, Celgene walked away and just had a tremendous negative impact on the company. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts on that strategy, and certainly if other people have thoughts as well, delighted to hear it.
Yeah, I think at its core, I like the concept of distributed research, which I think is what the strategy was in essence referring to, which is that we're never going to have the level of expertise in all of these very interesting areas of science, and so we're going to let really farm out that research to other organizations that do have the expertise and the focus. And we're not going to tie them up in a larger company bureaucracy, but we're going to let them run and go and create value. I think on the essence of it, I think that those are great things. I mean, I think that certainly some deals turned out better than others, and there are certainly elements I think that we ran into, and I was there, about how much control do you want to give to a smaller company. Again, one school of thought is we don't want to tie them up in the bureaucracy. The other school of thought is they're not going to do things to the same standard or have the same interests that we do as a larger organization. So I think that it certainly I think opened people's eyes to a different way of doing things, and I think was greatly successful in some instances and less successful in others. So that's somewhat of a non-answer for you, Marty.
No, it's helpful. And maybe to pick on and Timothy and Jennifer, because you have large pharma, small pharma looking at platforms. Diligence is always really hard for platforms. This is a question we just got from one of the attendees. So how do you, Tim at J&J, get comfortable with, looking at a new sexy platform that all the answers may not be filled? And then Jennifer, conversely, selling a platform to a pharma where both answers may not be known, and even if they are known, you may not want to share them.
Yeah, so two things. I think it's an area where, again, I think if you have, one asset using the platform that has progressed either in the clinic or not too far from the clinic, I think it makes the evaluation a lot easier because you can actually see the application of the platform in a particular example. Two, I think realistically, you have to understand that, DD for a platform takes a lot longer. There's sort of, you need to have buy-in from the partner's R&D organization, and that's usually not done overnight. And so as much as DD, it's also a question of, building relationship, getting to know folks early on, explaining to them, what your platform is and what you're doing, showing them data as it emerges, I think carries a lot of weight. It's very different than an asset where there's a set of data to look at. You've looked at the data and you're convinced or you're not convinced. I think for a platform, in order to get convinced, it takes longer, it takes more interactions, and a long relationship helps quite a bit with that.
Yeah, I think, along a similar vein, I think, there are two levels of selling, right? There's the platform technology, but then there's also the evidence base within the specific applications and the essentially the lead or nearest term applications, because that's ultimately what a company is going to be valued on, right? And so you need to sell both, but there needs to be a strong enough evidence base in at least one potential application to get a company excited. And it only really becomes a platform if you can prove it more than once, right? So I think that's, that's the two levels of selling that you need to do.
Well, that's tremendous. So we just hit the 2 p.m. Eastern mark for this. And based on the number of questions I'm getting, it's going to go on for another hour, but I will cut it short. Andy, Tim, Jennifer, Scott, it's been a tremendous conversation. To all the attendees, thank you for attending. For those who submitted questions, unfortunately, I think we only got to about 20% of them. So hopefully we can forward those additional questions to our panelists and they can help answer them. I want to thank Locust Walk and with them, our sponsors for today's event. Our next panel that I will not be running, but there will be a panel, we do these bi-weekly, will be on September 30th, very relevant to people who are participating today. So it's the path to IPO, preparing for success. We have some wonderful panelists, including Moji James, the GC for Community, Melissa Epperly, the CFO of Zentalis Pharma, and others to come. So we look forward to seeing you all there. Hopefully, we will all see each other in person at a BioBreak event at some point in the future. Obviously, cannot tell you when that will be, but we know for sure it won't be at JP Morgan this year. But we look forward to seeing everyone virtually. And thank you again for participating. Have a great, safe day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.